Financial independence means you are not dependent on the job you're in today. You have the freedom to leave and not worry. If you're not happy in what you're doing, do something else. That's financial independence. Early in my developer career, I got burnt out. And I actually did leave the tech industry for a couple years. And then what I found out is actually it wasn't tech that was the problem. I don't think people should necessarily chase those unicorns because it's a lottery ticket. You never know. I worked in startups early in my career and got offered lots of stock options. And guess what? They all blew up. They all went away. They amounted to nothing. And that taught me a very important lesson that your rate of savings is the single biggest predictor for how long it will take you to retire early. The money you need to be financially independent is not based on your salary at all. It's based on, if nothing else people take from this chat, Henry, do tracking, whatever that means. If that is just an Excel spreadsheet, do some tracking.
Do you think all of us here can really reach financial independence?
I would hope that being in tech, compared to other roles,
Hello guys, welcome back to another new episode of the Tech Lead Journal podcast. Today I'm very excited to have Kristine Howard with me. So Chris used to work in AWS as the head of the developer relations, but interestingly, she actually has started her early retirement. So she's into, 6-7 months now, and she just shared her story, and I found it really interesting for her to share it with us here, so that maybe for some of us who aspire to retire early, we can learn something from her. So Chris, welcome to the show.
thank you so much, Harry. It was really exciting to get the invitation from you and looking at the caliber of your guests that you've had. I mean, Rebecca Parsons, I was lucky enough to meet her once, and she's just a hero of mine. So to be in the same company as her is such an honor. Thank you.
Thanks for the compliment. So Chris, maybe let's start by sharing a little bit more about yourself. I normally ask my guests to share the career turning points, so something that you think we all can learn from that.
Sure. I mean, I've been working in tech for more than 20 years, pretty much my whole career. You can tell from the accent, I grew up in America, but after university, I knew I wanted to move overseas. So I got a job as a web developer and moved to England. And that's where I sort of really started my career in the tech industry as a developer. Eventually met an Australian and moved to Sydney. So I've lived in Sydney since 2001. And I was a developer for the first few years. And so I think the big sort of first career turning point was moving from developer into other roles, into being a business analyst. And the way that came about as a developer, I found that on my team I was working on, I was always the one that was doing the demos when we did showcases or when we showed our progress to our leaders. I was actually the one writing a lot of documentation for our users. I actually ran training sessions for what we built for some of our users. And I found that that was really resonating with me more than writing code was. Like, I like writing code because I like solving problems and I like making things. You can probably tell from my craft room behind me. But I found that there were other aspects of this job that I was good at and that I liked. And so the company I was in actually had a round of redundancies. And I realized this might be my chance to make a jump. So when I got the redundancy, I reached out to a former colleague who had seen me doing those things and said, I'm looking for work. And he said, well, we have a BA role. I can give you a try. And I know I can always have you be a developer if it doesn't work out. And that was huge for me. Like, I know it's hard to make those big career ladder jumps. And that was really great for me to be able to rely on my network and to have demonstrated that I could do some of those skills. And I think that's something anybody can do in their role, is try and get skills outside your day-to-day job. So that put me into the business analyst, and I sort of moved into being a scrum lead and did sort of, more project managey type of roles for many, many years, and ended up on a team at Channel 9, which is one of the TV networks here in Sydney, and I was kind of the glue person across the whole team. And we had a major reorg. And that was when I got asked if I wanted to move into a leadership role. And again, I think it was because as part of leading the team, of speaking to management, of just being across what everyone was doing, of being someone everyone on the team trusted, they sort of went, you know what? I think you're ready to move into being a manager, to being a people leader. And it was really scary. I felt super unprepared, but I did it. And so that was where I sort of then had to learn a whole new skill set again of what does it mean to actually be a people leader, to be a tech leader. And that sort of got me into the third phase of my career, really. So that was a really big turning point for me. And I pretty much stayed on the people manager track after that ever since. And there was only one other turning point I did want to mention for people, because I think it's so important. is early in my developer career, I got burnt out. And that happens to so many of us. And I actually did leave the tech industry for a couple years. I actually went and I worked in a local craft store here in Sydney. I was like, I just need to be away from tech. I need to help real people with real problems. And then what I found out is actually it wasn't tech that was the problem. It was the particular org or the role that I was in. Like I liked helping people. I liked talking to our users. As a developer, I was just so divorced from the users of our product. And so I ended up actually taking over the store's website. I became their webmaster. I built out their entire e-commerce platform. I was doing their social media. So I was still in tech, and I've sort of refound my love for it by actually getting out of the sort of 9-to-5 tech industry job and going back and really engaging with users. I know that's a privilege. Not everybody can do that. Like I took a huge pay cut for that, for which I was lucky enough to have a partner who still was able to make rent. I know not everybody can do that, but if you are feeling burnt out, I think changing things up for a little while can just give you a whole new perspective on what you like about your job in tech and maybe help you come back to it with renewed energy, which is what happened to me.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing such interesting learning points, which I'm sure many people can relate. So the first is about like jumping your role, right? From developer to BA. I think some of us might have that opportunity in the past, right? Also very difficult to kind of like navigate the new role. But I guess as long as you have the passion to do it, I think you may be doing it all right. And then the second one is about, leadership. I think many individual contributors might relate to this, right? So leadership is always scary in the first,
I was
in
terrified.
yeah, in the first place. But I think it can be rewarding, right? And so the last one is about burnout. So I'm sure many people might experience this. So I think changing things up, taking a break is probably a good idea as well. So Kristine, one thing that we'd like to discuss here is about your early retirement, right? So tell us a little bit more the story, how you got into this mode, so maybe something from there.
Yeah, this is something. Look, it was never it was not something that I was aware of or that I planned for from the beginning. My husband and I, we come from working class families. We just expected that we would work our whole lives. But being in the tech industry, you're pretty lucky. You have good earning potential. And so for, the first 10 years of our career, we bought a house pretty early and we just basically put all of our salary into that. And especially once I went back to tech, we were able to really sort of chip away at paying off our house. And that gave us a bit of security of feeling like, okay, we at least have somewhere to live. And then once the mortgage got paid off, we suddenly went, well, we're still earning a decent amount of money. And what do we do with it now? And so we started reading finance blogs and things like that. And that's what sort of put us on this journey. My husband worked at Google for 10 years. And they do a lot of internal education around personal finance, which was really cool. Like, I think if you're in a company that has anything like that, you should take advantage of it. And he saw a talk about financial independence that really kind of put him on that journey. And we started sort of thinking this might be a possibility. I didn't think I would do it. I thought he would do it. He's the kind of person who can be very happy, like just doing his own thing. And I always thought, I will not be comfortable without a job. Like, I like being around people and like doing stuff and like keeping busy. And I was like, I don't think I'll be able to do it. But for you, sure. And so, yeah, that was the goal initially, was to get him to that point. And then, yeah, we'll get there eventually. But I came around on it as well. But that's how it started, really.
Right. So I think many people aspire to kind of like retire early, got into financial independence and not having to work, all day, especially the jobs that they don't like. So I think it's definitely a privilege for, some people who
Yeah.
can reach that stage. Nevertheless, right, I'm sure there are some learnings that everyone, even though maybe some, different people have different situations, right? Maybe something that we can learn from that situation, right? So
Yeah.
you were about to say something?
Well, I was just going to say it's not necessarily, and I think you talked about it in our notes we were talking about, is it's about really financial independence as opposed to early retirement. Financial independence means you are not dependent on the job you're in today. You have the freedom to leave and not worry, like I did, of I'm burnt out, I want to go do something else for a while. That's financial independence, of being able to, if you're not happy in what you're doing, do something else. And unfortunately, I know for a lot of people, that's not possible. You've got family obligations, you're getting out of debt. There are a lot of reasons people don't have that. But I think FI, financial FI, as they call it in the community, means different things to different people. Like some people, it means I want to start my own business and not have to worry about it failing. For other people, it means I just want to take more vacations every year and fly business class, you know? And so I think it can mean whatever you want it to mean for you.
Yeah, so I think that's pretty good definition, right? Financial independence. So if you don't actually, you reach a stage where you don't actually need to depend so much on the day-to-day job, right? The 9 to 5, like typical corporate job that many of us have. So I think one thing that I would like to ask, right? Do you think all of us here can really reach financial independence?
I think everyone can reach in tech. I mean, I think you should be able to reach a level of feeling a little bit of security. I would hope you can. There is such a huge amount of privilege involved here, and I think that's important to call out. Is I know that there are lots of people in tech whose situation is more precarious than mine. To state it boldly, I am a white, cis, American passport holding, university educated. I don't have any disabilities that keep me from being able to work. And well, it seems a bit silly to call it a privilege. I don't have children, which in terms of monetary puts you in a different situation than someone who's caring for small kids. I don't have parents that either of us are supporting right now in our lives. So there's a massive, massive amount of privilege of being I live in a city with this not on fire at the moment. I have family members living in LA. I live in a country with national health care, so I'm not spending a huge percentage of my income every month on health insurance. I don't want to discount that. There's so much luck and privilege involved. There are many people who might not be able to have what I have, and I do know how lucky I am. But I would hope that being in tech, compared to other roles, you absolutely have more financial independence than people in many other roles who aren't as lucky as we are.
So I think it's really important to acknowledge, right? So everyone's path is different. We are not trying to kind of like make this, for everybody, but I'm sure there's some learnings that everyone can learn from your journey, right? So let's start from I'm sure like one of the big levers of your financial independence is working in tech, right? So I know from your career, you work in multiple, big tech companies, right? Where probably there's a portion of equity. So is this one lever that anyone who works in tech can actually use?
I mean, I don't know. I've worked with some younger folks who I think put a little too much emphasis on share equity. I worked in startups early in my career in the dot-com boom and got offered lots of stock options. And guess what? You know this. They all blew up. They all went away. They amounted to nothing. And I think that taught me a very important lesson that money in hand is worth more than pieces of paper because you have to pay the mortgage. And so I very consciously throughout my career, I worked on getting my salary up. And especially for women, we're not, and a lot of men I know as well, are not trained to negotiate hard. And I remember like my first job as a developer, my husband and I worked in the same company. And after we started going out, found out he was making like 20% more than I was in the same role. And it was because he negotiated harder than I did. I just accepted what they gave me. And that was a really big lesson to sort of advocate for myself. And yes, tech, I've moved jobs more often than he has because it's one of the main ways you have of actually jumping that salary band, of getting a bigger increase. It's hard sometimes in a company, you might get a small bump every year. You might need to jump in order to actually get those bigger leaps. But that's really how I got up the salary ladder. I was fortunate enough to work at Canva, who are a startup here in Australia. They're a unicorn. They're working towards an IPO. And they're one where I took a big pay cut to work there. This was going back to financial independence. I could afford to do that at that point in my career. And yes, they offered me a lot of stock options. I actually tried to negotiate more salary and less stock options from them because I was like, I've worked in startups. This could go away tomorrow. And right now, I think in terms of our retirement, like Canva, of course, was a lucky bet. It paid off. But that's a lottery ticket, man. Like I didn't expect that. And so I think Canva is probably about half our retirement savings. And the other half was from plugging away in corporate jobs of getting as much salary as I could. And shares, every share we got, we sold as soon as it vested. And I think a lot of people in tech, they get shares and they sit on them because they don't know what to do with them, or they think, well, they keep going up. Number goes up. I hang on to these. We very much took the approach of let's sell these and invest in other things, because if you're working for a company and all your retirement savings are in that company, if that company tanks, you are, pardon me, screwed on both fronts. You might lose your job and the value of your shares are going to go down. So by sort of diversifying, you at least reduce that risk of having your entire financial stake in one company, which is really important. So yeah, for me, a mix of corporates and one lucky startup. But I wouldn't, I don't think people should necessarily chase those unicorns because it's a lottery ticket. You never know.
Right. So first of all, both of us are not financial experts. So for those of you
Yes,
who listen
very
to this,
important to say.
yeah,
Very,
so
very
who
important to
listen,
say.
when you listen to this, just take it as a learning, right? Nothing that we advocate or advise here.
Not a
So,
financial advisor.
so have to get that out of the door. So I think you mentioned a couple of interesting things, right? So many people, not maybe these days, right, but maybe in the past few years, right, aspire to work in the startups and, chase that options like what you mentioned and dream of, they go to unicorn, they go IPO, somebody acquired them, and that stock options would worth a lot. So you're saying just now that something that is probably a risk, right? Because many startups actually fail and didn't even reach that stage. So for those of us who still kind of like thinking, should I focus more in corporate? Should I focus in startups? Should I go big tech? Any advice that you can give for people in that situation?
I mean, for us, it was pay off the mortgage. It was achieve some financial security, which if you're working in a startup that's paying you in options, that's not necessarily going to amount to much. So I only went to Canva after we kind of had built up some savings, because once you're not 20 living in a house with 4 other people and crashing on used IKEA furniture, that's fine. If you can do that for a few years in your career, it's great. I think it's a rite of passage. I did that when I was in London. I had a share house with the other developers and it was so fun. But once you sort of get a little bit further in your career, you realize I want to have a house. I want to have a car. I want to go on vacation, which means I need to actually earn money and not just, work for a startup that pays you on a hope of a future dream.
Yeah. So I think in the end, right, your basic salary, whatever that is, right, needs to meet your needs, I guess. So
Yeah.
I think it's always a very wise not to just accept the pay cut, put it
Yeah.
in the dire situation just for the chase of the options.
Yeah. I mean, if you are strongly convicted about a company, and I mean, look, Canva also, I didn't go there thinking this is my lottery ticket. It was, this is a product that people like, that they're willing to pay for, that aligns to my values, that isn't crammed with ads, and that seems to be run by people that I want to work with. So I didn't actually go there for the startupness of it. I went there because of the product and because I believed in it. And I think that's an important one too. I think if you pick something just because you think it's going to be a get rich quick, in my experience, that's not a way to have a very happy, fulfilling career.
Yeah. And you mentioned it's like getting a lottery, right? So I think we should always think of, the options or the shares that you got is some kind of a lottery. So don't expect that it will turn out for sure, right? Like,
Well,
to
especially
become
a
like,
company that's pre-IPO, that's not
yeah,
public. If you're getting shares in a public company, that's great. I mean, but that's part of your salary. That's part of your salary, and you should consider it part of your salary. That's what I think.
right. So equity definitely is one portion. So tell us other, big levers that you went through to reach this stage.
I think when we started out, the biggest thing we did, and I think we kind of did it inadvertently, and it turned out to be so useful, was tracking. And it's something I know most people don't do very well. So if I ask you, how much do you spend in a month? You might have a rough idea, how much you spend on groceries, how much you spend on rent. But do you know exactly? Do you have a data lake that actually you can ask these questions? And so we sort of, 15 years ago, when we got the house, when we got the mortgage and we started paying it off, it was like, what are we spending all our money on? Because people would say, are you buying too much avocado toast, young person? It's like, are we? I don't know. So we tried out a few different apps, and I'm an iOS person. My husband's an Android person. So we tried to find things that were cross-platform. And it was just like, keep track of what you spend. Now it's a little easier these days because a lot of the banks will actually categorize stuff for you as you spend money. And, we all mostly spend digital money these days, not real cash anyway. But just tracking that stuff. And for us, we were really granular, like every week or every 2 weeks. We'd go through all our bank accounts. make sure everything's in there, make sure it's up to date. And it's good for other reasons. You check and make sure you're not getting scammed. You don't have any charges on there that you don't recall. But that meant that as we got further along this sort of financial independence and retirement journey, it was like, okay, we know exactly what we're spending. We can actually now start to do stuff based on that data. We can actually, grocery bill is really low. We could start buying the organic stuff, and then maybe, or actually, no, we're spending too much on vacations. So maybe, the next vacation we go somewhere locally instead of overseas. You get that sort of muscle memory of capturing the data, of building in automations wherever you can. That's really handy as well if your bank or other places offer it. I mean, the software that we use at present actually can import from your bank, but it doesn't automatically do it. In Australia, it doesn't have the connections to the banks. I know in other countries they can just automatically set down all your transactions and categorize them for you. But we build charts and dashboards off that, which really gave me motivation as we started building up our savings. So I think if nothing else people take from this chat, Henry, do tracking, whatever that means. If that is just an Excel spreadsheet, do some tracking. If that is just looking at whatever dashboards your bank account gives you, or if you really want to get serious about it, start tracking right now using some app, all of your expenses.
Yeah, I think this is really important, right? You can't really improve something that you can't measure. That's kind of like the classic advice.
Yeah.
So, and you put the analogy of like monitoring, like monitoring system in our tech industry, right? So, and also building like a data lake or data warehouse where you got all the transactions, all the assets that you have, and kind of like track them. And maybe you build fancy dashboards, charts, and things like that. But also the importance of discipline. I think what you said, you do it every 1 week or 2 weeks. I think this is kind of like a long journey, right? You can't just do it for a month, and maybe also because you forgot, you would have forgotten all your
Even
transactions.
we're not perfect. So, I mean, you try and do discipline, but like I was doing it yesterday. I was catching it up and I realized, we were out like $30 on cash. We spent $30 in cash that we didn't write down. It was like, all right, it was probably at a cafe or something, like we're not perfect, but you can get pretty good at it.
Yeah. And I think from my experience as well, like once you started this habit and you kind of like benefit from it, I'm sure you get more passion, to actually do it more diligently. So I think tracking is definitely something that I would also advocate people to do, right? Especially if you don't have anything apart from your bank statements and credit card statements. But the challenge these days is like we have multiple bank statements and credit card statements, and you kind of like forgot like where things go.
I think once you get in the habit, I mean, it took me like 20 minutes yesterday maximum. Like it doesn't take a long time. Depends, of course, how many different bank accounts you're checking and how often you're doing it. But, hopefully you can get a system that's automated enough. But I just think the review is so good. It's almost like a daily stand-up or something. It's a check-in of actually looking at this stuff. Because I think it's very easy to just, especially when, instead of handing over money, you just tap your phone or your watch on something, you don't really realize you're spending money. And when you're forced to go through and go, did I really spend $9 on a coffee the other day? You go, oh, like that's important. That's important.
Yeah. So you might think that it's a little money that you spend on that particular time, right? But over, maybe at the end of the month, you'll realize, oh, actually, that's kind of like pretty big, right? Especially if you do it often. So I think another thing about tracking these days, right? So you mentioned about automation, right? I think in some financial system, you could actually do that. How do you actually automate, or what kind of automation that you built, maybe for some of us here to get some spark of ideas?
Yeah, so I'll mention the tracking software we're using at the moment. I don't want to, I'm not a financial advisor, and I'm not telling you have to use this one, but we've been using for many years now, You Need a Budget, or YNAB, which is great. It's good for tracking. It also has a whole sort of budgeting side. It's really useful for people who are trying to pay down credit card debt or something like that. We don't really use that side so much, but that's one. And it has a lot of built-in dashboards. So once you start tracking all this, it will tell you your net worth. Your total net worth. It can track your income versus expenses over time. You can start grouping things together in categories and then track those over time. So very early, I read a blog post about the balanced money formula. And this comes from a famous economy book. I think it was called Your Money or Your Life or something like that. Or maybe it was called Balanced Money Formula. But the idea is that you should spend no more than 50% on your needs. So that being like your home, grocery, like the food, insurance, like stuff you have to pay, transportation. 30% on wants. So all the stuff that, make life fun and living and going out and buying stuff. And 20% minimum on savings. And so what we did is once we started tracking, we kind of were able to, in our software, group into those categories. And then I was able to actually see on a pie chart, how much percentage are we doing? And okay, that was just a really early way for us to go, because we had no idea what our numbers should be. You don't know what you should be spending on groceries or what, but that gave us, okay, if our income is this, that means we should be doing that. And we realized pretty quickly that, okay, we can actually up that spending percentage, because wants, we were spending under. Needs, I think we started our needs at about 50, but as we paid down the mortgage and stuff, we were able to get that down lower. So that was some automation that's built into there, different graphs and charts and things like that. And then we actually built some ourselves. So I think, with an Excel spreadsheet or with a Google spreadsheet, we'd use Google because it works for both of us. We built some spreadsheets that tracked that over time, tracked our income over time. And eventually I got to the state where I had a little graph that I would update once a month, which had our net worth and it had our retirement goal as a line. So I could see that little line moving up there. And look, I wasn't sure if I was, like I said, I wasn't sure I wanted to actually retire at that point, but knowing that that's the point where I could, like that was hugely motivating. So building these little graphs and stuff. The other part of automation I think is important is it's not so much automation as every month or so we would, like I said, do a review, update our spreadsheets, and it sort of forced us to have a little chat about the state of how we were tracking towards our goals. And I know a lot of people, I'm very fortunate in that my partner and I have very similar approaches to money and very similar approaches to this. Some people, they and their partner are maybe not on the same wavelength with money and maybe find it easier to avoid those conversations. And I think that's very dangerous. So having these systems meant that we reviewed it and we talk about it. And that's, I think, an important part of automation as well. But yeah, also there's cool stuff. Like I said, we can't use in Australia, but being able to import all that stuff from your bank automatically into a tool would be amazing. That would be so good too.
Yeah, you touched on a very good point, right? For some people, they kind of avoid the money discussion or talking about money or even reviewing
Yeah.
about money, right? So I think this is also one mindset that we should try to, be more proactive in getting your money in order, right? So planning it, tracking it. So I think that's really important. And I think I like the balanced money formula that you mentioned, right? So if people are kind of not sure what should I aim for, I think this is kind of like a good formula, right? So 50% of your income should be spent on needs, 30% on wants, and 20% on savings. And I think many people have different philosophies, right? Some say that you should always try to increase your income, but at a certain point, probably that's not achievable, right? And that's when you actually need to kind of adjust your spending. And having a good tracking system like this could actually tell you how much you're actually spending each month, each day, and each year, right? So I think
Yeah.
that's
I
a
looked up the
really good
book.
tip.
The book was called All Your Worth, The Ultimate Lifetime Money Plan was where it came from. But I learned about it on a blog called Get Rich Slowly, which I really recommend is a good blog. That's where I learned about it. But yeah, it's a really easy starting point if you have no idea what your budget should be. Once you've got some data, then you can look at this pattern and start trying to fit to it, which was helpful for us to get started. The other automation thing I was going to mention real quick, Henry, is automating paying your bills. I think that was, luckily now you can do so much of that with banks. But I think earlier when I was in my 20s and I was an idiot, I forgot to pay the electricity this month. It's like you can automate that stuff, especially once you've got enough of a buffer in your bank account. You don't have to worry about, going over. Automate all that you can. Don't rely on this is SRE basics here, don't rely on human to do stuff that you can automate with a computer.
And especially if we don't have alert, right? So if the
Yeah.
the bills doesn't send you notifications, I think that's pretty dangerous.
Yes.
So you mentioned about this balanced money formula, right? I see that there's a ratio that kind of put in place. Is this some kind of budgeting? So you mentioned about budgeting just now earlier, right? So is this something that everyone needs to kind of get good at?
I think it helps. If you have goals of financial independence, the biggest thing you need to know is you talked about salary. And people think, oh, I'm on this, $200,000. That means I need to have 10 times that to No. The money you need to be financially independent is not based on your salary at all. It's based on what you spend. That's the important number, is what you spend per month. And so, yes, earning more salary makes your savings ramp up, which is good. And that's an important part of this. You're not going to get to early retirement just by not eating avocado toast. We all know that's not going to happen. But if you're in the tech industry, you're probably earning good money. I think having some sort of idea of what you're spending, because that will tell you, like as a very first goal you might have, and we did have this as our first goal, let's have an emergency fund of 3 months of expenses, not salary, because salary is irrelevant. 3 months of your expenses. That means if you get laid off tomorrow, if you decide you have to quit this job, you've got 3 months of a safety net. That is a good goal. And it's not based on salary, it's based on expenses. That's what you need to get to, is knowledge on what you're spending.
Yeah, so I think emergency fund, especially these days, very uncertain, right? So people got laid off in multiple countries, right? So always have this so-called rainy day budget so that you can at least have a kind of like a buffer in whatever dire situation, right? It could be medical, it could be job situation, it could be, I don't know, family emergency.
Yeah.
So this thing is actually very important. And I think, again, like you mentioned, thinking about how much you spend is actually very important towards your financial independence, because you could earn, as much as you can, but if you also spend it, like
Exactly.
without like
Exactly.
no tomorrow, right? So I think that's also not going to help you.
And there are different models for budgeting. I mean, the one that you need a budget is based on is called the envelope method. And there's different ones. So, but the envelope method goes back to when people were paid in cash. Imagine you get given $100 in cash and you have all these different envelopes. One is for rent and you put a certain amount in there. One is for, Christmas presents and you put a certain amount in there. One is for groceries and then you put them in, and then you only spend from the envelopes. So some of the software is actually designed to emulate that. And this particular one we use is. So every month we sort of know, okay, we're putting this amount towards groceries. We're putting this amount towards eating out at restaurants. This amount goes towards the electricity bill. And once you have the buffer, it's less important if you can go over. But the idea is that you can move around between the envelopes. Like, okay, I've spent a little too much this month on one category. I can move it out of something else. And so there's a lot of financial literacy stuff on YouTube, on blogs, that was really helpful to us and that can help you with this stuff. So I'm sure there are other models for budgeting. That's just the one that I know the most.
Yeah. So I think the envelope, what I learned as well, the envelope method can actually help you. If let's say you don't have a discipline about spending, right?
Yeah.
You basically just put it in first, right? And then whatever left over is something that you can kind of like use for that particular month.
And you need a budget, does it? Like I have on my phone, I have actually a widget that shows me what is in my allowance for the month. So, we've paid ourselves an allowance, each of us a month. So it's like a certain amount of money that we can spend if I want to go and buy something. What did I buy recently? I don't know. I bought some concert tickets or something. I can look at this. And if it's green, that's how much money I've got in there. If it's red, I've overspent for the month. So it's almost like a sort of digital version of that envelope.
Right. So one tips that I saw in your presentation as well, you mentioned that people should opt for OpEx rather than CapEx. This is like the corporate world, right? Going to the cloud, you don't buy servers anymore. But they tell us a little bit more about this philosophy, right? So why we should trade off, like CapEx for OpEx?
Well, the example I'll give for that is owning a car. I mean, look, you're in Singapore, right, Henry? Do you own a car?
No, I don't.
No, exactly. If you live in a city where you don't have to, how many times a year do I need a car? Maybe 5 times. When I go to IKEA or when I need to drive somewhere that there's no public transport to. And so we're very fortunate here. We have a car share in Sydney where I'm a member of it. I pay a membership fee and I can then rent a car by the hour on those occasions. So that's my analogy of, instead of the CapEx of buying a car, of storing it in a garage, of paying insurance, I actually can just get one when I need it. It's like using the cloud. It's, pay as you go, as opposed to owning a thing that you need to keep. And so that's something that we've been trying to do, is if you don't need a thing like all the time, rent it, rent it if you possibly can, because even if the rental cost seems high, you are still going to be far ahead from what you would have paid to own the thing. And so that's just one tip, I think, on budgeting. Look, it doesn't work everywhere. Like I grew up in a rural area. You have to have a car or you can't get around. But I think if there are places where you don't have to buy a thing, that's what you should do.
Right. And this is also probably going back to the needs wants thing, right? So if cars is something that you need, maybe for your job or whatever,
Or if you like them. If you're a car person, you're a car guy, you like it, that's your hobby, sure, that's a different thing. But for me, it's just a way of getting around. And yeah, I don't need to have an expensive asset sitting there most of the time.
right. And I think these days there are so many renting options, right? You mentioned, we can rent a car, we can rent even dresses that, I learned
Yeah,
also
that's a
last
good one.
time.
Like a fancy event. I think you can rent things now as opposed to buying something new. That's a good one. Or using an e-bike to get around. Like there's all these like options now. You can do that in big cities. Again, this is really important. I'm living in major metropolitan areas, but yeah.
Right. The other portion that I'm sure that you do very diligently is about the savings aspect, right? Or investing. So tell us some things that you think we all can learn from you as well.
Okay, and this is again not a financial advisor because my understanding is you can get in trouble if you give people financial advice and you're not a financial. So I am not, my husband is not. But our strategy, so as I said, once we paid off the mortgage, it was like, okay, well, we're starting to build up our savings account. And, interest rates have not been great they're getting better now, but for a while there, they were low. Like you were getting nothing on having money in a bank account. As I heard, what do we do with this? And so there are a few people that we learned from. So there's a blog called Mr. Money Mustache. That was one I read. There was also this guy, his name is, I think, J.L. Collins. He wrote a book called The Simple Path to Wealth, and he gave a talk at Google that's actually on YouTube, so people can watch that. But he's the sort of godfather of this financial independence movement. And one of the things he talks about is spend less than you earn. So, of course, by tracking, that helps you make sure you're doing that. Invest the surplus. So whatever's left over, you're going to invest that and avoid taking on debt. Do simply this and you'll wind up rich. That's what he says in this talk. And so, okay, invest. Well, you know how to do that. We don't come from families that have stockbrokers, on speed dial. But so reading some of these blogs and stuff, it seems that a lot of people talk about investing in index funds, which, and again, this is me as a layperson, is basically like it's a bucket of spread across the entire stock market. So instead of investing in a single company, you're investing basically in the economy as a whole. And over time, that pays pretty decent returns, pretty good historically. Like not as good as being in a unicorn startup, of course, but that's not the goal. The goal is to actually just build wealth securely with minimal risk. And so that's what we did. As I said, we sold the stocks we got given by our employers, and we basically just started putting them into index funds. So that was our strategy. I know that other people think, paying off the mortgage first actually may not have been the right thing to do because you have to look at the interest rates. Like what interest were we paying on our mortgage versus what we would get for putting that, like paying the minimum on the mortgage and maybe putting it into the stock market. We felt we wanted the security first of knowing that the house was paid off. But other people, I would advise anyone to talk to a financial advisor and get some advice on this. We have done that more recently just to make sure that our strategy is sound. But for us, it was about sort of not putting it all in any one thing and of spreading it across as many businesses as possible, basically.
Yeah. People have different preference in terms of investment, but I guess the gist that you just mentioned, right? So if let's say you are a low risk taker, right? Something
Yeah,
like
to me.
investing in an index fund definitely makes sense, right? Especially these days, I mean, people want to chase higher returns, right? But it could come with a higher risk as well.
Yeah.
So,
And if you're
and
younger, I think your tolerance for risk might be different. So I think that's a factor as well, where you are in your career. For us, lower risk was important. And so, I mean, that was the way we approached it. I think the other thing is which country you're in. You have to be really careful with that. Like as an American overseas, there are certain things I'm not allowed to invest in, or there's a lot more reporting that's required on that in terms of taxes. So this is where having an accountant or having a financial advisor, once you get to this stage, can be really helpful because they can make sure you're doing stuff right. You're not going to get bitten. And also because, we live in Australia. I grew up in the US and have family in the US that I will eventually want to provide support to. So for us, we've spread our investments across multiple countries because currencies fluctuate. We know this as well. So look, if you're in one country, you're only going to ever spend money in that country. You can invest in that country. For us, it made sense to spread it beyond that.
Apart from countries, do you also diversify into, different types of risk portfolio or something like that?
Yeah, we haven't done much. I have friends. I was talking to someone recently, another person on the path to early retirement who's doing properties, bought properties and in doing that. We haven't done that. We've sort of talked about it, but again, part of it is tax implications and stuff like that. And part of it is just like, it seems like a lot of work and risk for not great returns necessarily. But that's one that I know that people do, is invest in investment properties. There's things like bonds, of course, and I think we have a small amount in bonds. It's not the biggest part of our portfolio. And there's other types of investments as well. For example, here in Australia, a friend of mine runs a fund that invests and provide loans to small businesses. Not a VC. It's not trying to find rocket ships. It's trying to find businesses that provide a return. And so we've invested in that business, because they're giving a good return and it's good financial sense, but also because it's investing in small Australian businesses, which is one of our values. It's important to us to support people here in this country. And so we're doing that. It's not going to make us rich, that one alone, but it's something that we feel really positive about, having that as part of our structure as well.
I think that's a pretty good thing, right? Especially if you invest at the same time also promoting something that you value. So I think that's pretty good. You mentioned that in the balanced money formula, 20% is for savings. Do you actually
Minimum
put all
20%.
Yeah.
Go higher. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you put all this into the index fund? Because I know that this term called dollar cost averaging, right? You put it every month if you do it diligently, right? Because historically, all the economy will rise, right, over the time, especially for a long time. Is this also something that you use as your strategy?
We don't put everything in there. I mean, our savings, we track that savings rate over time. And I think Mr. Money Mustache talks about your rate of savings is the single biggest predictor for how long it will take you to retire early. So the more you can increase your percentage of savings, and you do that by minimizing your expenses and by increasing your salary. So get the savings. And by the end there, we were almost up to 50% savings, which was great. We don't put it all into the investments. Like, we generally keep, as I said, emergency fund. You want to have an emergency fund in probably a local bank that you can access of a couple months. So if anything terrible happens, you've got that and you can get it right away, should you need cash right away. You don't want to have to sell stocks because you fell down and broke your leg and you need to go to, whatever. Like, you need to have ready liquid capital. So we keep some of it in bank accounts. And that's where, some of the banks now offer like special increased rate savings maximizer type accounts. And so if you can put it in a bank account where you get a little bit more percentage of interest on it, that's basically what we do. And you can get that money out pretty quickly, but we tend to keep several months of expenses in a bank account just because, that gives you a little bit more security.
Yeah, just to emphasize, no matter what your risk profile, always a good idea to actually have this emergency fund or rainy days
That's step one.
budget. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think one aspect that I would love to listen from you as well is the story just before you reach that possibility of going to retire early. I'm sure this is something that is not easy, for many people, because we all want to retire early, but when we almost reach there, it's kind of like a situation where it feels uncomfortable and probably scary. So tell us, how do you go through that particular period?
Well, my husband did it first. He did it 2 years before me. So he was approaching his 10 years in his role. And, he was getting to that stage where every Sunday night he was dreading going to work in the morning. And he liked his team. He really liked the role he was in, but he wasn't sort of engaged with the project they were on. And so I said to him, this is a bit cheesy, but as a mentor, what I often do with people is I go through a values exercise. And so I sat him down and we went through this. Like, what are the times in your life when you felt like you were really killing it, making the right decisions? You were, just really crushing life and work and everything. And he came up with a few, which most of them were from before he met me, which slightly insulted, but whatever. And then you go through this big list of values and you start whittling down to the ones that really sort of define you at your best, that you're proud of. And for him, they were belonging, expertise, and useful. And what we found was that the role he was in was delivering on two of those, but the useful. He didn't feel that necessarily that the contribution that he was making or that the particular thing he was working on was very useful. And that was part of the reason why he was dreading it. And I was like, well, we need to get you into things that do tick those boxes. So he quit. And for 2 years, I had a house husband, and it was the best thing ever. Highly recommend it for anyone. He handled everything. When we were overseas at the time, he handled our move back to Australia. He's handled our house renovation. He handled all of the financial stuff, buying the groceries, cooking dinner every night, which freed me up to focus fully on work. I was like, wow, this is amazing. Everyone needs a house spouse. It's so good. I understand now why men had this for so long. And so I enjoyed my job. I could have quit at that time, but I was loving my job. I had less stress because he was taking care of everything at home. And so I kept going. Then a year or so ago, I started to feel it was becoming less fun. Look, generative AI has taken over our industry. Many of us know this. I was less enthusiastic about that than about the other things that I was doing in my role. I think people still need to know how to build secure containerized applications, of how to build well-architected serverless applications. And instead, it felt like as an industry, we were just telling everyone to use coding assistants. I became less enthusiastic about that. And our company was, our team was going through a bit of a reorg, and it felt like, you know what, this kind of feels like the time is right. Like it just sort of started feeling like, okay, I'll give it a go. And I set myself a goal of 6 months. I'm not going to take a job for 6 months. I'm going to reconnect with my hobbies. I'm going to reconnect with my friends that I feel like I haven't seen. And so my team were amazing. I love them. They sent me off with such a nice send off, and I really can't say anything bad about them. I love them also. They were just fantastic. And the first month was super weird. It felt like I was kind of on vacation. And I feel like I almost went through a little bit of a period of depression there as well. And then it gradually I've kind of gotten into the routine now, to the extent that now the surprise is after 6 months, I don't think I want to get a job. I kind of figured I would be crawling the walls by now, but I'm not. Like, people kept saying to me, what will you do? And I was like, well, I started keeping a list on my phone, sort of a year or two ago, of what would you do if you were retired, just to see. I have a huge list of books to read, of video games to play. I want to ride my bicycle. I want to go do these classes. I want to volunteer. Like, I had a huge list of things. I want to learn a foreign language. I want to learn to play the cello. Like, everybody has stuff that they would do. And so I've been working away on that list, and I'm actually loving it. Like, I may get a part-time job. I've had a few things that I think would be interesting, probably not in tech. My husband, he ended up getting a part-time job. He leads craft beer tours in Sydney. His hobby is brewing beer. And so he gets to every now and then share that with other people, to get outside, to walk around, to talk about something that he's an expert in. I would like that. Something like that. Something that allows me to sort of like engage with other people on the things I'm passionate about, like we're doing right now. Like this, I love this. So I think that might find something like that. I'm not sure yet what it is, but yeah, that's been the journey to get here.
Yeah, thank you for unpacking that situation, right? Because I'm sure when we reach there, we also kind of like confused, like, okay, what's next? The transition, the period where you feel uncertain. And I'm sure the first month is not just the vacation that you felt, right? I think the income aspect, because normally
That
at
was
the end
scary.
of the month. Yeah. So tell us, how did you feel about that?
I knew, like, intellectually, I knew that, your investments actually, at some point, you start getting dividends from your shares. This is a thing that I never knew growing up, but like, yeah, you own stock in an index fund or in a company. Most of them will pay you some money. It varies different countries and things like that. But it's like, okay. And then you also have any savings accounts you're getting interest on and stuff. And at some point, you realize that that amount of money will cover your monthly expenses. And that's really the goal. That's where you draw that line of what's my retirement goal is I know that, and there's different formulas for calculating this. I think the biggest one is you want to have, there's this 4% rule people talk about, which is you want to have enough money that, because you ideally want to have this money last for 30 years, or in my case, I'm 47. So I plan on living longer than that. So I need it to last. And you also want to account for, like, look, 2008, we had a global financial crisis. So in order to account for down years, you need to have the buffer in there. And so I think the 4% rule says you should aim for about 25 times your expenses per year. Once you have that in your retirement, that's when you can start to think about it. That's what we did. And so having the salary go away, though, I remember just being like, but the bank account's not, like, it's not going up. It's only going down because you don't see all the investment stuff. They're not in there. And so that's where having these, like, every month we would have a little, how are we tracking chat to make sure that I understood that, no, we're not just, draining our funds. And that's why I made that in my blog post. You saw the little Sankey diagram that Rod pulled for me, my husband. We actually still earned more in that 6 months than we spent, which is crazy without a salary. Because, yeah, I worked it out. Our income dropped to about 25% at what it was before I quit. I was on a good wage by the end there. So that took a little bit of a mind flip to get around.
Yeah, that was a very cool Sankey diagram. So the one that you visualize how you still earn something, right? And how you spend the money. So I think definitely if you track, you can come up with something like that. I think that's pretty cool to me. So you have gone through this, 6, 7 months. I'm sure you have enjoyed so many different experience, also not having to worry about day-to-day job, right? So for people who are still trying to reach there, I'm sure you have done several things that you think you could have done it earlier, right? So what will be some
Yeah.
of the things that you think are fulfilling for you now, but something that everyone or maybe you could have done it even earlier?
Well, I think one of the things I'm doing lately that I'm loving, and I did a little bit of before, is volunteering, is giving back. And I was fortunate at Amazon when I worked for them, they had opportunities to do that as an employee. And if your company does that, a lot of corporates do, or even startups like Canva did. That's so wonderful. Like I remember at Canva, we had a day where we went and we all were at an offsite in the Philippines and we visited a shelter for women and children who'd been trafficked. And we spent time with them. I taught many women to knit. And it was like one of the most rewarding things I did in tech, and it had nothing to do with tech. At AWS here, I did it earlier last year. We went and spent a day helping a charity in Australia that provides clothes. They collect clothes that don't sell from businesses, and they provide them to people who've been in disasters, refugees, people who are escaping bad situations. And so I spent the day like sorting clothes in a warehouse to help them. And I did that. My employer gave me the day off, but you can also do some of this stuff on the weekend. And that just made me feel so fantastic. Right now, Rod and I are helping out with the Sydney Festival, which is an arts festival that happens every year here. And so I volunteered, there's this big thing for kids that's been happening where you bring your kids in and they run around and they climb and swing and everything. And I volunteered for that. And I saw a talk a month or two ago from Mark Pesce, who's an Australian sort of real big leader in the tech industry here. He gave a talk about how people are living longer lives. And he talked about the way that you can stay healthy as we get older is to stay active, to stay engaged, and to stay contributing. And so those were kind of the things I've been thinking about going into retirement. But I think those are the things people should think about regardless. Like, are you being active in the sense of, are you eating the right things? Are you being healthy? Are you walking? It doesn't necessarily have to mean doing CrossFit, but, are you staying an active human being? And look, in tech, I was not necessarily doing that. And so it's something I'm enjoying doing more of, but I think everybody could do more of. Engaged. Like, are you seeing your friends? Are you in part of a community? Or are you just working and coming home and not engaging with the outside world? And I think that's important as well. And you can do that. I've been an organizer for the Sydney Tech Leaders Meetup Group for many, many years. And that's one of the ways I stay engaged. I meet my peers. We share lessons learned, similar to this, like you're doing with your podcast, is a community. So I think being part of a community is something you can do even as part of your day job. And mentoring is part of that as well. I think absolutely mentoring juniors is a great way to stay engaged. And contributing as well. So whether that's through volunteering, whether that is through charitable donations at a very minimum, that's something that we could all do, is really important to do. And those are things I think you don't have to be retired to do that stuff.
I love those three aspects, right? Staying active, staying engaged, and stay contributing, right? Contributing to something, the cause or the values that you really enjoy doing. So I know that we have talked a lot. So is there something that we haven't covered that you think people should still learn from you?
Oh, what am I going to talk about? I think I've covered everything. Oh, one of the things I was going to mention, the transition to being retired, I was going to mention for the ladies, like I never realized how much time and effort we have to spend. For men, it's easier. You get up, you throw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and you're fine. But like I used to get my hair dyed every 6 weeks because if you're a woman in tech and you have gray hair, this is potentially could actually affect your earnings. Do you know how much money and time that, we spend to look professional in our jobs, makeup and things like that. And let me tell you, not doing that, like, it's so great. Like money saver, time saver. Yeah, that was something I didn't anticipate. Is now I get my hair cut at the $14 place at the mall, and I don't have to get up as early in the morning, and I don't have to make sure when I do a Zoom call that I'm very presentable and everything. I can just be me. That was really unexpected. Is a lovely benefit.
Right. That's definitely a fun thing that people can learn from you.
I've stopped
Definitely.
dyeing it. You can see it's getting gray. It's doing it.
Right. So, Chris, it's been a great conversation. I'm sure we all learned something or two from this conversation, be it tracking, budgeting, investing, whatever that is, right? So, I think thanks for sharing that. Before we close the conversation, I normally ask one more question to my guests, which I call the three technical leadership wisdom. So, think of it like advice for aspiring tech leaders here. So, if you can share your wisdom here, so what would that be?
So I had a couple I thought of. So the first one was important to me is that career paths are rarely a straight line. And I think you saw that with my path. But, I did a course at AWS once on, I think, career conversations for leaders or something like that. But we had everyone draw out their career journey on a piece of paper. And I felt really embarrassed because mine was like all over the place. And I thought everyone else was just going to be straight line to leadership. And then when we went around the room and shared, everyone's looked like that. I think there was one guy who had like come out of uni in a job and stayed at the same company and progressed. Everyone else was like, well, that year I got laid off and then I moved overseas. And at this company, I was doing well, but then I had a disagreement with my boss, so I quit. And everyone had these, or burnout. I said burnout. I've had a couple redundancies in my career. I've moved internationally. I've changed industries. I've changed careers. I've had corporate startups. So everybody's graph does that. Don't feel bad about that. That's okay. So I think that's a really important one that I wish I had known earlier in my career. I think knowing your values is really important. And I mentioned the values exercise, and I can share that link with you, Henry, if you want to share it with people, but there's an article online about it. But I think these change over time as well. Like what your values are when you're 25 and starting your career are different than when you're 35 with a young family, or when you're in your 40s thinking about, what's my retirement plan looking like? And it can help you when you're facing those, because when burnout happens, it's because you're not living in alignment with your values. And so that's where my husband was trending, when he made the decision to actually quit his job. And so I think doing that every few years is a great check-in, both for you, for anyone you're mentoring. I mean, for me, creativity is an important value for me. It's something that I was feeling I was losing a little bit in the role I was in. I think that's one of the things that helped me make the decision. I think adventurousness, my role was really good for that. Like I had a lot of travel in my role. I loved going new places. Like it ticked that box. And positivity. I like being a positive person. I like trying to affect positive change in the world. So for me, those are right now the most important things. And my retirement journey is about finding ways of things that actually align to those. And that's what's going to make me happy. And the last bit of wisdom I wanted to share with people is to do the things that scare you. And there's a book you've probably talked about on this podcast, I'm sure, Henry, called Mindset by Carol Dweck, which talks about growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And I learned about this in a meetup in Sydney years ago. And it was like a light bulb went off. It talks about the fact that there's two types of people. If you're a person who, as many of us in tech were when we were young, we got praised for being smart. And for some people, that makes you very afraid to do new things where it might not show that you're smart, because that means you're a failure as a person. It means that you get a certain amount of intelligence that you're born with, and that's it. And that I think about the things that I didn't do in my career because I was afraid I wouldn't be good at them. And then when I heard this talk, growth mindset people think everything is an opportunity to grow. I might not be good at that now, but I can learn and I can get a little bit, maybe I'm not going to be the best in the world at it, but I can get better at it. And so this was something that became a bit of a mantra for me. It meant that, I went to a tech conference here, Linux Conference Australia, which had a hardware workshop where we were going to be soldering, circuit boards together. That's the kind of thing where in the past I would have been like, oh, no, I'm not interested in that. Secretly, I was interested. I was just afraid that I would be bad at it. And everyone would be like, oh, the girl sucks. But I did it. I went, growth mindset. I might not be the best, but it's okay. And I had such a good time. I learned so much. I wasn't the worst. I learned welding. I have done a 3-day Haskell functional programming course. These are things that I would not have done before I learned about this growth mindset concept. And you don't have to read the book. There's YouTube videos about it. But it's such a useful model, I think, for so many of us that are worried about being imposter syndrome, about being found out to be a fraud. If you have that, go into things with that growth mindset, do things that are scary. That's what opens you up to growth as a person.
Wow, it's pretty beautiful, right? I think it's very, very good wisdom towards the end, right? So when you say don't be scared to do something new, growth mindset. And I think I also listened to Tim Ferriss in the past, right? If you really want to grow and be really successful, chase the fears that you have, right?
Yeah.
So don't be kind of crippled by the fear and wait for the opportunity. Instead, you just chase the fear. I'm sure for the extreme, maybe that can work really well as well. But for some of us who are probably a little bit more hesitant, again, the mindset is don't be afraid of doing something new and, fail, so to speak, right? So, Chris, it's been a pleasure. I know that you probably don't have kind of a professional link where people can find you, but
I have a blog. I've been getting back to my blog. I've been doing a lot of blogging these days. So that's probably the best place to find me these days.
Right. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure people would love to connect with you and learn more about financial independence and, early retirement. So thanks again for being here, Chris.
Thank you for having me. I'm so passionate. I keep whacking my microphone because I was so excited to talk about this. So thank you so much. It was really fun.
My pleasure.